Girivardhari Gopijana Balabha Girivardhari Gopijana Balabha Girivardhari Jasodanandana Brajajanaranjana Jasodanandana Brajajanaranjana Jamunatiravana Chadi Jamunatiravana Chadi Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari Jasodanandana Brajajanaranjana Jasodanandana Brajajanaranjana Jamunatiravana Chadi Jamunatiravana Chadi Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Vishnupad Paramahamsa Hari Vajagacharya Astatarasata Srimad His Divine Grace Sri Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Gaur Premanandi. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Resuming Uddhava Gita Chapter 8 from Canto 11. This is the title of the chapter is the story of Pingala, the prostitute, and the Aviduta Brahmana is giving a description about her and what he learned from her. Now there's some language here that says she saw the Aviduta Brahmana as her guru, but he's seeing her as his guru. And, the theme overall is detachment. And detachment based upon knowledge detachment, jnana vairagya, that enhances bhakti or helps remove obstacles, the obstacle of attachment. Text 27. As the night wore on, the prostitute, who intensely desired money, gradually became morose, and her face dried up. Thus, being filled with anxiety for money and most disappointed, she began to feel a great detachment from her situation, and happiness arose in her mind. The BBT purport reads, "It appears from these verses that on this particular night the prostitute Pingala was not at all successful in attracting customers to her house. Being completely frustrated and disappointed, she gradually became indifferent to her situation. Thus, great suffering sometimes leads one to the path of enlightenment, or, according to a Sanskrit proverb, disappointment gives rise to the greatest satisfaction." Paragraph. The prostitute had dedicated her life to satisfying the lusty desires of many men, engaging her mind, body, and words in the service of the paying lovers. She completely forgot the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus her mind was most unsteady and disturbed. Finally, being completely frustrated, her face and throat drying up, she began to feel indifferent to her situation, and happiness arose in her mind. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's purport: the prostitute Pingala, who was greedy for money, dedicated her life to satisfying lusty men. As a result of engaging in the service of conditioned souls with her body, mind, and speech, and forgetting the service of the Supreme Lord, her mind became extremely restless. Finally, she became so frustrated that she became indifferent to her situation, so that happiness began to arise within her mind. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur writes, the prostitute, who intensely desired money, gradually became morose, and her face dried up. Because of that worrying for money, she began to feel a great detachment from her situation, and happiness arose in her mind. Worrying about money was the cause of her detachment. Next, text 28. The prostitute felt disgusted with her material situation, and thus became indifferent to it. Indeed, detachment acts like a sword, cutting to pieces the binding network of material hopes, desires. Now please hear from me the song sung by the prostitute. Sung by the prostitute. Report. Network of material desires is created when one falsely thinks that he established himself permanently. This binding network cut by the sword of detachment, Otherwise, one will be forced to wander in the illusory network of Maya with no understanding of liberated life on the spiritual platform. Bhaktisiddhanta's purport. Those who cannot gain freedom from the bondage of their social position and family responsibilities, if they take up the trident of detachment, they can cut the knots of material bondage and attain auspiciousness. Those who are too attached to material enjoyment and are addicted to bodily pleasures cannot understand the messages of the self-satisfied Supreme Lord, being bound by the ropes of illusion. The Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur's commentary, Shrinu Yata Mama, means hear from me as it is. Detachment is the sword for cutting the ropes produced by hopes for material enjoyment. Pingala thought, my ambitions are the cause of my material bondage. Detachment or indifference is the only weapon by which this network of bondage can be cut to pieces. The function of the Puranas is to explain the Shruti portion of the Vedas. And it does so by historical reference. The philosophy extracted within the Shrutis is exhibited in real life, within the histories. So it's natural that it's a story within a story within a story. Shukadeva is describing what Krishna said to Uddhava, who was describing what the Avanti Brahmana said to Yudhisthira, to King Yadu, which is narrating what the prostitute was understanding by her circumstance. The philosophy can be embellished and understood through real life situations. And we may not have the good fortune of having a prostitute as our friend. And, or any materialistic person that is attached to these features of sensuous enjoyment and so forth and so on, and thus being blocked because of that attachment, being blocked from their relationship with the personality of Godhead and getting signals from the personality of Godhead. So this is kind of an extreme, although the principle is everywhere, the attachment to sense gratification as a way of life. And it just, this just happens to be a pretty unpleasant profession. But nonetheless, people do have unpleasant professions of different kinds. And to understand there really isn't happiness here. Now, one may come to that conclusion when there's an abundance of unhappiness. One may come to that conclusion even there's abundance of so-called happiness, that is money or the fruits of piety of different kinds, this and that, and it just doesn't result in happiness. That's good. It's good fortune that one can realize there isn't happiness here. But in many cases, people don't get that signal. They get the signal that this is happiness. There's a buzz within the senses, and I just have to adjust things a little bit and get more. Then have an abundance of enjoyment. There must be something that lures materialistic people to chase after objects and bring the senses in contact with sense objects. There's something that's perceived as enjoyment when for a transcendentalist it's miserable. There's so many examples, but just take alcohol or cigarettes. it's abominable. But once one becomes influenced by that mode, by bad association, etc., it becomes, you can't live without it. It becomes an addiction. So addiction to just the principle of sense enjoyment is the Upanishads speak about detachment, and the Bhagavatam is illustrating it in various ways. But that's why we're hearing this, why Krishna is saying it to Uddhava. So here's the first of her, I guess he's calling it prayer. O King, now this is Vivanti Brahmana speaking to King Yadu. Just as a human being who is bereft of spiritual knowledge never desires to give up his false sense of proprietorship over many material things, similarly a person who has not developed detachment never desires to give up the bondage of the material body. This is Bhakti Siddhanta's translation, slightly different. O King, just as an ignorant person with no spiritual knowledge is never inclined to renounce his false sense of ownership, similarly a person who has not developed a sense of detachment will never give up his attachment for the material body. Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur's commentary is really short. This verse describes the necessity of detachment. The Aviduta Brahmana begins to explain the purpose of this narration. The text 30 is our final verse for this morning. The prostitute Pingala said, "Just see how greatly illusioned I am!" Exclamation point. Because I cannot control my mind, just like a fool, I desire lusty pleasure from an insignificant man. Purport, BBT purport. In material existence, all of the senses are attracted by different objects, and thus the conditioned soul becomes a first-class fool. The cause of material life is one's indifference to the absolute truth. The conditioned soul considers himself to be the Lord and enjoyer of the material world and considers the purpose of life to be sense gratification. The more one tries to enjoy the material world, the more one's illusion increases. Paragraph. It appears from this verse that the prostitute Pingala was not only earning her livelihood through prostitution, but was actually enjoying her illicit contact with innumerable men. The words kantad asataha indicate that she was freely selling herself without discrimination to the most ordinary and useless men, considering them to be, quote, lovers. Thus she said, quote, I was a great fool. The word Balisha means one who has a childish mentality without practical experience of right and wrong. Bhaktisiddhanta's purport. The senses of the conditioned souls are naturally attracted to the sense objects of this material world. This is the prime example of the conditioned soul's foolishness. Paragraph. Some people who are actually averse to the Lord's service try to artificially check their senses from engagement in sense gratification for some time, but this actually does more harm than good because of their misunderstanding regarding the absolute truth. Paragraph. Foolish people consider other sense enjoyers to be their masters, and thus they pray to them for the fulfillment of their own sense gratification. However, as soon as one becomes enlightened in spiritual understanding, his life of material enjoyment can be transformed into a life of spiritual perfection. Vishwanath Chakrabarti. Pingala said, "See the extent of my illusion. Because I cannot control my mind, I desire love from an insignificant man. By this I have become a fool." The word kama means lusty desires. Pingala is in effect saying, I desire to become satisfied in sex, and thus I can understand that I am completely illusioned. Okay. Now, the focus is on her occupation, and so therefore the focus can go the number one attraction in material existence, that which literally keeps material existence perpetuating, is procreation or act of sex, the attraction that exists in human bodies or any bodily form is that one that keeps perpetuating existence. Very, very strong force. However, one can extend that understanding to in the more broad sense of indulging the senses and attraction for sense objects without any restraint. That's material existence. So let's take a look at Ruti Mangara's interesting creation. If you notice in the lower left corner, there's a sword. You just kind of superimpose that on this painting. Here's the message. The network of material desires is created when one falsely thinks that he can establish himself permanently in the material world. This binding network should be cut by the sword of detachment. Otherwise, one will be forced to wander in the illusory network of Maya with no understanding of liberated life on the spiritual platform. And the next image is, I recognize it, is Narcissus from Greek mythology. He's looking at his reflection in the lake and he's overwhelmed with fascination. Just as a human being who is bereft of spiritual knowledge never desires to give up his false sense of proprietorship over many material things, similarly, a person who has not developed detachment never desires to give up the bondage of the material body. Now, we're used to hearing these kinds of things, and the putting it in the context of the story, Pingala. I mean, even Krishna is doing this with Uddhava. Uddhava is very, very learned. He doesn't need to just give sutras from Vedanta Sutra or philosophical statements from the Upanishads. He's giving, not because he's a less intelligent person. It's powerful. The message is powerful. Developing detachment. This is the summation of why this is being narrated. And the necessity of developing detachment. And otherwise, if that necessity of detachment, then one maintains bondage and it brings suffering. And finally, the more one tries to enjoy the material world, the more one's illusion increases. Interesting graphic. It looks like the self-sabotage graphic from another presentation. But that's material life. And this is the last image. The causes of material life is one's indifference to the absolute truth. She must really have fun in creating images to match. Person turning away from Krishna. Indifference to the absolute truth. In our chanting of the holy name, this is one of the causes of not being able to focus on the chanting. It's just indifference. Indifference to the name, indifference to the person, indifference to the higher purpose of life. Indifference. So say conversely, having a clear, coming to the point of having a clear sense of purpose will help us focus. And there's lots of other things that are keeping our attention because of this indifference. So we're hearing again and again, 3 chapters worth of knowledge and detachment. The chapter that follows that, coming attractions, the qualities of a self-realized person. So we're looking at the becoming detached, becoming situated in knowledge, and then comes characteristics of one who's in knowledge, one who's self-realized, living in the world but not distracted and attached to all that brings misery and suffering. Ultimately, the process of self-realization, something that Prabhupada would often say, what's the question of understanding Krishna if you can't understand even yourself? So you can say self-realization is the goal of our bhakti process, but self-realization is incomplete without God-realization, but it's the starting point, understanding matter and spirit distinction, Samkhya, and then acting accordingly. So knowledge alone isn't enough. It's the acting with that understanding. But going back to the question that started all of this, Uddhava's saying, kind of like he's one of us, that he can't understand Krishna because of his undue material attachments. So how to become free from those attachments? So that I can understand you. He's asking like Arjuna is asking. He's asking as if he's one of us, and he's not. But that's his mood. Humility. It's not play acting. It's it gives a nice indicator. Even if one becomes advanced, the characteristic of humility is part of that of an advanced person. And the advanced person, like Sanatana Goswami saying, Kayami, what am I? Why am I suffering in this world? That was on the calendar at the home we were at last night. Sanatana Goswami with the straw in his teeth. Who am I? Why am I suffering? If I don't understand these things, how can there be any good for me in life? And he's highly learned, but submitting himself before Krishna. Uddhava submitting himself before Krishna. And Krishna is illuminating very affectionately. And similarly, all the rest of us, knowledge and detachment to strengthen the clarity of our purpose of bhakti, making our Krishna connection, just like this. The cause of material life is one's indifference to the absolute truth. And that indifference has its consequences. It means attachment to something else. Okay, let's see if there's some discussion. Count and Sundar Ananda. At least one, if not multiple.
Yes, sir.
Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for a nice class, for that, especially sharing the commentaries also. Thank you. I have several things, but I'll start with one, Maharaj. About the overall principles in this whole thing. I want to clarify my understanding of this topic a little bit. So, basically, we're cultivating our bhakti towards Krishna, and that we're developing attachment towards bhakti, attachment to Krishna, attachment to Guru, and then in the process, I am also mixed currently, so I have some material attachments also. So we also hear from that 10 offenses. Last offense is if I have material attachments, even though I understand so many instructions on this matter, then there is an offense. So that means we need to work on our material attachment also. So one of the way to do that is cultivating detachment, like in this section, through knowledge. And that knowledge, my understanding is there are two elements to it. One element is...
Your understanding is what?
There are two different elements to that knowledge.
Okay.
One is the dangers of engaging in something for our spiritual life. One. And second thing is the spiritual knowledge that gives the positive knowledge how Krishna is wonderful, how Krishna's service is wonderful, like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the principal detachment from here. And then other thing I'm understanding is that just by performing bhakti, like we know from second chapter verses, just by performing bhakti also it contributes towards detachment. Knowledge and detachment comes from bhakti. However, and also from the previous class you were talking about how at the spontaneous attraction stage,
I was talking about how
it's spontaneous attraction stage.
Sometimes your voice speeds up and I lose some syllables.
Sorry.
It's just my ear capacity is diminishing.
I'll be careful. Practice.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the previous class, you were talking about how spontaneous attraction stage. At that stage, natural detachment is there at that stage. Yeah, like that.
Yes.
But at my stage, when I'm here, so I can cultivate detachment through knowledge and also through regulation, like we hear in Bhagavad Gita, some regulation also, right?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Buddha. Another?
You got a good score on your Bhakti Shastri essay.
Sorry.
Well spoken. Very well spoken. I guess just some editing or addition to the last part. The spontaneous, you're using your hand motion, spontaneous stage is way up here and I'm down here. So what I can do is regulate and cultivate detachment. Now, just to add to that is, it's incomplete, or it's not going to sustain. It'll be intermittent at best if the bhakti principle is not receiving your attention. And the bhakti principle is, this is for Krishna. Now, in the beginning stage, the this is for Krishna part is not spontaneous. Using that frame that you just expressed. And given that understanding, therefore, in the practicing stage, the bhakti for the pleasure of Krishna part needs to get conscious attention. In addition to the regulation and cultivation of detachment, add so that it'll bring me closer to Krishna, so that it will be pleasing to Krishna. It's, some bhakti principle along with that. In my present stage, these are things that are these are helpful procedures for me. Add the bhakti principle to those procedures, and then it's just sustainable, and the bhakti principle will grow naturally, because otherwise the bhakti principle may not grow. It just may make one stoic or hard-hearted, or again, intermittent sometimes and sometimes not, and sometimes drawn again to the senses, and not progressing, not sufficiently progressing. Okay?
Confirm, clarify the practice of the bhakti. Clarify the practice of the bhakti principle. Here is how I understand it as of now. One is that is this act pleasing to Krishna and Guru? From my understanding, that is one aspect I look at.
It's the consciousness of. That's the bhakti principle. Pleasing to Guru and Krishna. The cultivation of that consciousness. Is that all right?
Yes.
Here's a little example. In the bhakti training that Vishnu Jan engaged people in, because he was like a classic bhakta. When we rise in the morning, we should think, why am I rising early in the morning? When you go to take your morning bath, why am I taking this? Even just simple things. When I'm applying tilak, why am I applying tilak? When I'm putting on my dhoti, why am I? So it's the for whom. It's not just a subservience. That's the beginning. Well, Prabhupada said, but the bhakti principle enhances beyond, the obedience to a higher order is for the pleasure of. Okay? Got it. One more. Keep going.
Thank you. There was from one of the commentaries, there was a statement, worry of money was the cause of detachment. Worrying of the money was the cause of detachment for Pingala. I could not understand.
Well, okay. The worrying about the money caused her grief. And when she recognized, this isn't bringing me happiness, it's bringing me grief, that was the cause of her detachment. It's not, there's some steps after worrying, worrying about and being attached to money. Some steps after that. Okay? How are we doing? Anything else? You have something online. Go for it.
This is from Shravya Kanchi. We are recommended to read Prabhupada's books. Is my understanding correct that reading books gives us knowledge for detachment towards the goal of bhakti? And secondly, they serve as a medium to associate with a pure devotee. Are there any other reasons to thoroughly read Srila Prabhupada's books that I am missing out?
Well, you hit two important points. There's just different ways of expressing the same thing, is one way of responding to your question. It's purifying the mind and the purifying of the intelligence and purifying of the hearing process. That is to say, from Bhagavad Gita, we know that lust has different sitting places, and by hearing attentively, reading Prabhupada's books attentively, trying to understand, the intelligence is becoming purified, the mind is becoming purified, the hearing process is becoming purified. So that's another way of saying, another dimension of the benefit of reading Prabhupada's books. Another way of saying what you said, it may be included in what you said, but knowledge is the antidote for ignorance. Light, as light is the antidote for darkness. And when light is there, or when ignorance is removed, when knowledge is there, then our suffering diminishes, and that's an encouragement to keep going because we want to be happy. So it's a step in the direction of the higher happiness. The higher happiness is not just knowledge. We're having some discussion with some devotee yesterday that their father has consistently encouraged them, don't go for this, mushy bhakti thing, go for knowledge, because their father particularly values knowledge. And so her father, doesn't understand the purpose, the application of knowledge, which is kind of what your question is addressing. And my response to Sundarananda's point as well is there's obstacle. We have a desire to connect with a higher reality, and we don't know exactly what that is. We have some vague idea based upon our upbringing and so forth. We have some vague idea. But what the actual idea is not what it could be, should be. So by that purification of the mind and intelligence and so on, the purification permits a greater clarity about transcendence, about the source of everything, about the absolute truth has form, and keep going. That you can not only have a relationship of service, but in the activities of the original personality of Godhead in Vrindavan, you can be his mother or father or friend or lover. So the impetus to go beyond knowledge is within the bhakti process itself. So that's one of the benefits of reading Prabhupada's books, is getting the darkness of ignorance removed. So suffering is diminished. And then light comes, and understanding what that absolute truth really is. Now, it's not Prabhupada's creation, it's just coming from the Bhagavatam and Vedic knowledge in descending process, but that's a benefit. You become clear and clearer and clearest what goal of our human existence really is, the opportunity that's available to you in this human form of life. So those are some additional thoughts.
Next question is from Alicia Israni. Maharaj, in spite of knowing the Sankhya philosophy, why does the taste for material enjoyment not go away permanently from its root, the tendency to enjoy?
I really like Jiva Goswami's explanation about this in Bhakti Sandarbha. And his answer, keeping it simple, is it's the power of anarthas that are in the heart. The power of anarthas in the heart are so tenacious that they block the power of knowledge. They block the power of bhakti even. And therefore, because they're very powerful and tenacious, it takes time again and again and again to remove those anarthas in the heart. The anartha nivritti stage is commonly is gradual because of that reason. So knowledge is not sufficient. Even bhakti in its beginning stages is not sufficient. It requires again and again and again repeated devotional efforts and being exposed to those points of knowledge. Just like this. This is the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam. I mean, already the whole 10 cantos and all of Krishna's pastimes. And here we are with Vyasadeva giving this description of something that took place in Dwarka towards the very end of Krishna's presence, going over the same points again. So it's necessity. So why is because of anarthas in the heart. And the ratification of anarthas in the heart is it's a laborious effort because they're very strong. It's just the design of what happens when you make offense. It's a very serious thing. There's consequences that are hard to overcome. That's why.
Next question is from Amara. Hare Krishna Maharaj, what was Pingala's qualification to get such profound realization? Is there any mention how did she apply this realization in her life?
Stay tuned. Coming attractions in the Uddhava Gita. It doesn't say, the first part is her qualification. Your first part of the question is qualification, meaning, did she do some pious activities previously, or was she some kind of special personality or something like that? We don't have that information. At least I'm unfamiliar with anything she did previously to make herself eligible for such a sudden, startling turnaround, the 180. Why? What was going on with Pingala before this epiphany happened? We don't have that understanding, nor on the other end exactly how she applied. Because even we have the experience, don't we, that some light goes on and we understand something now that we didn't understand before. And how long is it going to last? So one of the essential elements is helping it last is good association. No, that could be a practical application. Did she go for good association instead of the other kind? I'm not aware of any description on that either end, other than what she's realizing and why. And it's some super soul turning the light on.
Next question is from Shreya. Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. In Bhagavad Gita 7th chapter, Krishna mentions about 4 pious men, and among them Jnani is dear to him. What we are learning about knowledge in detachment now, is it same as knowledge is Jnani? Is my understanding correct? Thank you.
Nice question. Jnanis are, on the one hand, regarded in the language of the Bhagavatam as ineligible for bhakti if they just stay stuck in the position of knowledge. Jnane prayasa udapasya. Knowledge, or it's in Kunti's prayers, the Jnani is ineligible. So that, or say it the other way, bhakti makes one eligible. So if in the 7th chapter verse, the Jnani comes to the position of taking shelter of Krishna, there's another verse in Bhagavad Gita that when the Bahunam Janmanam Anti Gyanavan Mam Prapadyate, if that Gyani comes to the position after many, many, many lives of cultivation, knowledge, to Mam Prapadyate, surrender to Krishna, then that's what's being spoken of. The eligibility because of detachment from knowledge. But supposing one just has knowledge without, with some detachment, but no bhakti, then it's another story. So a short answer is yes, but a conditional yes. The Gyani that Krishna considers special is one who takes shelter of him, that kind of Gyani.
This is from Girivaradhari Prabhu. Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. Taking Pingala's example, she's attached to money and she's teaching detachment as a guru. In practical world, we see similar examples, but because of discrimination attitude, I neglect such teachings. How can I be non-judgmental to learn detachment in the real world around me? Thank you, Maharaj.
Well, you have to be elevated, because otherwise, if you're not elevated, then you become a speculator and, a sojourner in the world of the mind. So I would recommend for you and for most of us to become fixed, strongly fixed in the principle of receiving knowledge through descending process, so that we actually have that connection, and then we become more liberal or more open-minded or more receptive to understanding things that are of the world and the lessons that can be learned of the world. Become attached to knowledge that comes through disciplic succession before extending that principle of gaining knowledge from things of this world, because otherwise it can be very speculative. Most likely would be. If your heart is aligned with Krishna, then surely some things will come and you'll understand some things from things of this world. But I'm just speaking about the principle of the orientation of faith and connection with Krishna through that descending process comes first. Next. Okay. Anything? Bangsidhari, how about you? You're absorbed in what you're doing.
We are
Having some issues, so he's absorbed in the issues. Is it working out?
it's going on.
Going on. Okay, our online people apologize for our technical issues. You have something else? Okay, let's go. You have something too?
Yeah. I long time back in Puri Yatra, you were sharing about Raghunath Das Goswami, how he elevated his austerities
Yes, he
to
did.
please Lord Chaitanya also. So in that context also, you were describing how he was thinking that waiting outside the gate of Jagannath temple,
Like a prostitute.
like the prostitute. Yeah, so the principle we need to learn there was I should not see, okay, how he will give happiness to me, how this person is giving happiness to me. Is that the principle we need
Yes.
to learn? Okay.
Yes. It's, it's dependent upon, to be dependent upon Krishna. Now, be dependent upon Krishna doesn't mean don't take any initiative. Just be a blob. That's not depending upon Krishna. He did do something. He went to the place. He went to the place where he did several other things besides standing at the gate and thinking like he was thinking. He wasn't pleased with himself with that mentality. So eventually he just took a very simple approach and discarded rice, etc., etc. So he took some initiative. You have something?
I don't know if it's really a question, but just have been thinking about indifference. I was reading something in a book of Shivram Swami about the whole, like how it starts when we fall down. It actually starts with just a little indifference in the sense of not even like an active thing, but just, you're neutral or not acting actively in relationship with Krishna. And that really struck me.
Yeah.
And from then on, and that's what really causes us to kind of latch on to that sense gratification program, just from that little neutrality towards Krishna.
I like that point. I like that point. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. We can see that in the lives of it. It's slackening or complacency. Complacency is disease. It's a choice, and it leads to downfall.
Yeah. Yeah, and from that position, from being Brahma, and then we come so far, and then we experience that, as you were saying, in our chanting of the holy name, that indifference,
Yes.
which is really like hard, because until that indifference gets rooted out, it's very difficult to like get absorbed in the holy name. And there's no real solution for that other than Krishna's advice of practicing detachment, even in the Bhagavad Gita. Right? I mean, like
point.
really bringing the mind back from wherever it goes. There's no other process really to kind of, I mean, of course, knowledge and everything, but the control of that mind, it's so important.
Is that a large or a small section in his writing?
A few pages. Yeah.
For the benefit of our listening audience, could you cut it and paste it and send it to Vangsidhari, and you can send it out to our listening audience? I'd like to see it myself, because I think it's really, right on, brother.
Yeah. Yeah.
Significant.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking of the indifference that comes from getting absorbed even in sense enjoyment, but then getting burnt out. There's this other kind of indifference which causes more hardness. And so just processing of, what are the steps really, or what do we need to be conscious of in our own heart to make sure that the indifference that comes from getting burnt in the material life, sometimes really hard, in a hard way. What are some things we can do to stay soft and devotional?
There's two categories of indifference. One is complacency or laxity, and the other is being burned, because they're very different, and it leads to falling, and falling means the senses start wandering and the mind starts wandering, and it's two different categories as far as I can understand. And your question that you raised is very similar to my response. I really like Sachinandan Swami's response to Gopal Bhatta Prabhu's question in this Chaitanya Charitamrita series, something like, we hear that the name of Krishna, you use this word absorbed. So could you expand on that? What does absorbed mean? And so he does his thing, the body, mind, and heart. So the absorption of the heart is the remedy, which is in response to your question, the sadhu sangha. So being in the company of those that are absorbed, or those that aren't distracted or complacent or negligent or indifferent. Be in the association of those who are ignited. And that will help ignite you. It will help ignite us. And so reading of Prabhupada's books is one, because he's absorbed. And reading and associating with others, in physical proximity or through writing and sound vibration with others, that sadhu sangha is really wonderful. I compliment the GBC strategic planning team in what they have done by providing devotees throughout the world virtual association with devotees of a whole spectrum of backgrounds and realizations and tastes and scriptural references, and I'm sure it's that principle that will cut into indifference through sadhu sangha, through devotees that are absorbed, and they've got they have their hearts and they have the realizations, and they're free to say, and they say, and it's a big panorama of realizations and expressions of their lights on. They're not feeling indifferent at all. It's really, I really appreciating what he's doing. He and that group. And they're gonna have to come up with an encore when this is over. I'm sure they will. And the pandemic window is going to wind down, and people will spend less time doing that and more time doing the in-person. But while we have it, it's sadhu sangha of its own. Most likely something will continue going forward in time. But, the past is not going to be the same as it was going forward. Sadhu sangha will come in different ways. And those that are listening that are not connecting with the sadhu sangha, please do so. That it's overwhelming what the options that are out there. You're never going to, because there's like 5, 6 every day. But it's really rich, and it'll impact this indifference difficulty. Guaranteed. Srila Prabhupada ki.